The Wyoming Territory, 1870. The wind always moved first. It swept down from the high ridges, carrying dust like memory, whispering across the open plains before rattling against the boards of William Carver's ranch. To most folks, Wyoming was a wide, empty land, barren and merciless. To Will, it was the only place that never asked questions. The man who owned more acres than he could ride in a day lived as though he owned nothing at all. His house solid pine with a sagging porch stood in the middle of a valley that had once rung with laughter, with the footsteps of a woman and the bright chatter of a boy. Both gone now, one to fever, the other to grief too heavy for her to bear. 5 winters had passed since Will lowered 2 coffins into the earth, side by side beneath the cottonwoods. He had spoken no words over the graves. Words had left him. The way color leaves a photograph when the sun bleaches it year after year. Now he worked the land like a penance, branding cattle, mending fence, cutting hay. His hands were always busy, his heart always still. People in town said he was a rich man, but wealth meant nothing when a bed stayed cold and a table stayed empty. On this day, as the wind carried the bite of an early winter, Will saddled his bay gelding and rode out to the supply trail. He needed salt blocks and lamp oil. He didn't expect to find anything else. But life has a way of placing sorrow in the path of sorrow. Like flint striking steel, the trail bent near a dry creek bed, and that was where he saw them. A woman, thin, staggering, skirts torn by the scrub. She leaned hard on a walking stick, fashioned from a broken wagon spoke. At her side trudged a child, no more than 7. The girl's braids had long since unraveled, leaving dark hair tangled across her face. She held her mother's hand with the stubbornness of someone who knew that letting go meant being lost forever. Will reined in his horse, watching from the rise. The mother's face pale beneath sunburn and exhaustion was the kind of face that had once been proud, he could tell. High-boned, framed by what must have been soft brown hair before dust and sweat turned it dull. But her cheeks were hollow now, lips cracked, eyes shadowed by hunger. The way she moved told him she had not eaten in days. The girl stumbled, knees buckling. The woman dropped beside her, clutching her tight, whispering in words Will could not hear. Then, with effort that tore something inside him, she pulled the child back to her feet. Will nudged his horse forward. The girl saw him first. Her eyes widened, too large for her small, sunken face. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. The woman turned, and when her gaze landed on Will, she froze. For a moment he thought she might bolt like a deer. Instead, she pushed her daughter slightly behind her, standing as tall as her weary frame allowed. "Evenin'," Will said at last, voice low, graveled by disuse. The woman licked her lips, her hand tightening around the girl's. She tried to answer, but only managed a rasp. Finally she said, We mean no trouble." Will dismounted, moving slow. He kept his hands where she could see them, like approaching a spooked horse. "Didn't figure you did." The girl peeked around her mother's skirts. Will saw her small shoulders tremble, but also saw the way she pressed her lips together, fighting not to cry. Children who had already learned silence. That knowledge cut him deep. "You got a name?" Will asked gently. The woman hesitated. Trust was a currency she did not spend easily. At last she said, Clara Sloan. "This is my daughter, Lizzie." Lizzie. The name hit him like a stray bullet. His wife had wanted a daughter once. They'd argued over names in the warm dark of summer nights. Lizzie had been one of them. Will cleared his throat, forcing the memory back. "I'm Will Carver. My land's not far." Clara straightened, a spark of dignity in her, even as her knees shook. "We don't need charity." He studied her, then the girl. Lizzie's ribs pressed against the faded cotton of her dress. The child was starving, yet she stood close to her mother like a soldier guarding a wounded commander. "It ain't charity," Will said slowly. "It's survival. You keep walking this road, you won't see another dawn." Clara's eyes glistened, but she bit her lip until blood came rather than let tears fall. She had learned long ago that weakness invited wolves. Lizzie tugged her sleeve. Then, in a voice soft as wind through dry grass, she whispered, "Mama, please, I'm so hungry." That broke the silence. Clara's shoulders sagged. She nodded once. Back at the ranch, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather. Will set a pot of beans to boil while Clara sat stiff in the chair. Lizzie perched on her lap. The child's eyes followed every movement of the spoon, every curl. Of steamed dot when Will finally set 2 bowls in front of them, Lizzie's hands shook so badly she almost spilled it. Clara steadied her daughter's fingers, guiding them as if the act of eating was something fragile. She did not touch her own bowl until Lizzie finished. "You need it too," Will said quietly. Clara looked up, startled. "I'll eat after." "Now," he said firmer. Their gazes locked. For the first time she didn't look away. Something passed between them, defiance, gratitude, maybe both. Then Clara lifted the spoon. Will watched from across the table, his own bowl cooling. He saw the hollows in her cheeks, the bruises half hidden beneath her collar, the faint scar circling one wrist. Not the kind a wagon wheel leaves. The kind left by rope. He forced his hands into fists beneath the table, nails biting his palms. He had sworn never again to get tangled in another person's suffering. His own grief had been enough, and yet here they sat. A woman who still carried herself like she had something left worth protecting. A little girl whose eyes pleaded for. More than food. Will rose and went to the window. Outside, the land stretched wide and cold beneath the fading sun. A hawk circled in the distance, the only shadow that moved. Behind him, Clara's voice broke the silence. "Why are you helping us?" He didn't turn. Maybe because once, someone should have helped me. And they didn't. The words hung, heavy in the cabin. Lizzie leaned against her mother, eyelids drooping. Clara stroked her hair, her hand trembling only slightly now. She looked at Will, really looked, and for the first time he saw something besides suspicion in her eyes. He saw exhaustion, yes, but also the faintest flicker of trust. Will stayed by the window long after they slept, shotgun across his knees, watching the horizon. The world was full of wolves. He knew it better than most, but tonight, under his roof, 2 souls rested who had nowhere else left to go. And for reasons he could not name, that mattered more than anything he owned. Morning came to the Carver Ranch, with a pale sky and frost clinging like glass to the grass tips. The stove crackled in the kitchen, the only sound in a house that had once echoed with laughter. Will Carver stood by the window, mug of bitter coffee in his hand, watching steam rise as the sun crept above the ridges. Behind him, Clara Sloane stirred. She had not slept much, that much was clear. Her dress, washed and drying by the fire, still clung to the scars of travel dust stains. Torn hem, one sleeve unraveling. Wrapped in a wool blanket he had left, she sat in the corner chair, with Lizzie curled against her chest. The girl's small breaths whistled through chapped lips, her thin fingers clutching the fabric, as though afraid it would vanish if she let go. Will turned away from the window. He set his mug down on the table, pulled a knife from his belt, and began slicing bread that had gone hard overnight. Clara opened her eyes at the sound, blinking against the light. "You can sleep longer," he said quietly. "I've slept enough," she replied, though her voice was hoarse, as if truth were. The opposite. He cut the bread without answering. Silence had always been easier for him than questions. Later, when Lizzie stirred awake and he set food before them, Will finally asked what had been on his mind since yesterday. "How long since you ate proper?" Clara hesitated. Lizzie reached for the bread, but Clara steadied her daughter's hand before answering. 4 days, maybe 5. Will's jaw tightened. He watched Lizzie tear into the bread with the desperation of a starved colt. Clara guided each bite, making sure her daughter ate slow, even though hunger was written plain in her own face. And before that? Will pressed. Clara's eyes lifted, brown and sharp despite the weariness. Long enough. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all she was willing to give. By mid-morning, Clara stepped outside to hang their washed clothes. The Wyoming sky was raw and wide above her. Will joined her, hauling a pail of water from the well. For a while they worked. In silence, her small frame moving stiffly against the wind, his larger one steady beside her. Finally she spoke. My husband's name was Daniel. Will looked at her, surprised by the sudden offering. She didn't meet his eyes, only kept pinning cloth to the line with wooden clips. He took sick 2 winters ago, she continued. Cough turned to fever, fever to silence. Left me with debts I couldn't pay. She paused, fingers trembling on the fabric. The men who came for the wagon said they'd take me too, settle the account that way. I ran instead. Been running since. Will set the pail down, his knuckles white around the handle. He knew the kind of men she meant, bankers, who turned wolves the moment the law's back was turned. He knew the smell of desperation they left behind. And the girl? He asked softly. Clara glanced toward the cabin where Lizzie still played. With a wooden spoon he had given her, her face softened. She's the only reason I kept moving. Every mile, every step was for her. When I couldn't eat, I gave her my share. When I couldn't carry her, I dragged her hand in mine. She doesn't know how close we came to not making it here. Her voice broke on the last words. She turned. Quickly, blinking hard at the horizon, Will looked at her, and for the first time in years, he let himself speak of his own past. My wife's name was Mary, he said. The words felt like gravel in his throat. She gave me a daughter, June. Sweetest little thing you ever saw. Used to laugh at the sound of chickens clucking. Got sick one summer. Fever burned her out in 3 days. Clara turned her head, meeting his eyes. Mary couldn't bear it. Buried June one day, laid Mary to rest the next month. Left me with a ranch full of cattle and not a damn thing worth living for. The wind tugged at his hat brim. He swallowed hard. Since then, it's just been me. Workin', mendin', watching the land turn and the seasons roll by. Clara studied him, her face unreadable. But she didn't turn away. That afternoon, trouble found them. Will was in the barn repairing a broken harness when he heard the thud of hoofbeats on the road. He stepped outside, shotgun leaning against the wall, and saw 2 riders slowing near his gate. Both men wore trail dust and grins too sharp for honest company. One pointed toward the cabin. That her? Will's stomach sank. The lead rider dismounted, swaggering toward the yard. Name's Pike. Got word a woman came through these parts. Dark hair, little girl with her. Belongs to some folks down south. Owed 'em money. We're here to collect. Will stayed where he was, his frame blocking the view of the house. Ain't no one here belongs to you. Pike smirked. Funny, 'cause we got paper says otherwise. He tapped his saddlebag. Debt contract. Her husband signed it before. He'd kicked. Transfers to the wife and child. Clara had stepped onto the porch without Will noticing, Lizzie clutching her skirts. The color drained from her face. Please, she whispered, barely audible. Not again. Will raised the shotgun. Barrel steady. Turn your horses around. Pike laughed. Or what? You'll shoot? Ben what, rancher? Law'll side with the paper. Will's voice dropped to a growl. Law don't live out here. But my fence line does. Cross it again, and you won't. Ride back. The second rider shifted uneasily. Pike spat into the dust, but he mounted again. This ain't finished, he warned, pulling his reins tight. No man keeps what ain't his forever. Will didn't lower the shotgun until their silhouettes shrank to specks on the horizon. When he turned, Clara stood frozen on the porch, eyes wide with fear and shame. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. They'll come back. Will's voice was steady. Let him. I've buried worse men. For the first time, Clara's defenses cracked. Tears spilled hot down her dust-streaked cheeks as Lizzie clung tighter to her waist. Will stepped closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but never touching. No one takes you. Not while you're under my roof. The promise hung between them like iron. That night, when the lamps burned low, Will sat in his chair by the door, rifle across his. Lap. From the other room he heard Lizzie whisper to her mother. Mama, do you think he means it? Yes, baby, Clara murmured, voice trembling but sure. I think he does. And for the first time since she'd buried her husband, Clara Sloane let herself close her eyes and sleep without dreaming of chains. The next morning dawned with a stillness rare for Wyoming plains. No wind rattled the shutters. No dust trailed across the yard. The quiet was almost unsettling, like the land itself was holding its breath. Will Carver rose before sunup, as he always did. Habit, not hunger, dragged him from bed. He stoked the stove, boiled water, and set a tin pot of coffee near the fire. He didn't expect Clara or her daughter awake yet. But when he stepped out to the porch, boots crunching frost, he saw her already in the yard. Clara knelt by the pump, sleeves rolled, hands raw as she hauled water into a basin. Lizzie sat nearby on a folded quilt, clutching the wooden spoon Will had carved for her yesterday, making little shapes in the dirt. He stood watching longer than he meant to. Something in Clara's movements caught him. She was fragile in frame, but not in spirit. Every motion was deliberate, determined. She didn't complain when the pump squeaked or the basin sloshed cold water across her skirts. She just worked, jaw tight, eyes steady, as though defying the world to break her again. When she caught him watching, she flinched, not with fear, but with the instinct of someone who'd been stared at too often for the wrong reasons. She wiped her hands and pulled Lizzie close, standing straighter. You don't need to do that, Will said, his voice low. It needs done, Clara replied, simple as fact. Will nodded once and went to the barn. He didn't stop watching her, though. Not entirely. The day stretched out in chores. Will mended the southern fence line, while Clara washed clothes near the pump. Lizzie trailed between them like a colt torn between pastures, sometimes playing near her mother, sometimes wandering toward the barn where Will worked dot by noon, the girl perched on a hay bale, eyes wide as Will hammered a new rail into place. Why's it bent like that? She asked, pointing to the warped wood. Storm cracked it, he answered. But if you set it right, it'll still hold. Lizzie's nose scrunched. Like Mama's wrist? Will paused mid-swing. He turned slowly, saw Clara watching from the yard, her hand frozen mid-wash, her eyes dark with shame. Lizzie didn't notice. She twirled the spoon in her hands, humming off-key. Yeah, Will said, softly. Like your mama's wrist. Bent, but strong enough to hold. Clara's face shifted. Not a smile, but not quite pain either. She bent back to her work. That evening, supper was quiet. Will ate slow, pushing beans across his plate, while Clara divided small portions for Lizzie before serving herself. The fire crackled, filling spaces words couldn't. After Lizzie fell asleep on a quilt near the hearth, Clara stayed seated at the table, eyes fixed on the lamp flame. "You should have let them take me," she whispered suddenly. Will looked up, startled. "You risked your land, your life," she continued. "Those men, they don't forget. And for what? A woman too broken to be of use?" Will set his fork down. His gaze was steady, voice low. "You think you're not worth fighting for?" Clara's eyes brimmed with tears she didn't let fall. "I know I'm not." Silence stretched long. Finally, Will leaned back in his chair. "I buried a little girl once, my own. Thought I'd never see another smile worth living for. Then yours tugged my coat in that market." Clara blinked, stunned. "Don't tell me she ain't worth it," he added. "Don't tell me you ain't either." Her hands trembled. For a moment, she seemed ready to argue. Instead, she looked away, shoulders bowing under a weight invisible, but heavy. That night, Will bedded down on the floor again, rifle within reach. He didn't see Clara standing in the doorway long after, blanket around her shoulders, staring at him with an expression too tangled to name. Days slipped by in rhythm. Clara cooked when she could, though her hands shook whenever a pan clattered too loud. Lizzie trailed after Will, asking endless questions about cows, saddles, and the stars above the barn roof. Will kept his distance watching from the porch when Clara drew water, standing by the fence when Lizzie helped her gather eggs. He never touched them, never intruded, just stood as a wall between them and the horizon. But the distance narrowed, little by little. One afternoon, Clara carried laundry to the line and stumbled on a loose stone. Before she could fall, Will was there, catching her elbow. His grip was firm, steady, but when she froze at his touch, he let go at once, stepping back. "You're fine," he said simply. Clara swallowed hard. "I know." She kept working, but her hand brushed the place he'd steadied her again and again, as though still testing if it had been real. One night, a storm broke. Rain hammered the roof. Thunder rolled like gunfire across the plains. Lizzie woke screaming, clutching her mother. Clara tried soothing her, but every thunderclap made the girl shake harder. Will pushed the bedroom door open, lantern in hand. Clara looked up, fear in her eyes, not of him, but of being seen so vulnerable. "She won't call," Clara whispered. "She thinks the chains are coming back." Will set the lantern down, crouched near the bed. He spoke low, calm, like he had once for June. "Easy now, little one. It's just Sky talking. Can't hurt you in here." Lizzie peeked at him through tears. "You promise?" "I promise." The storm raged, but Will stayed by the bed until her sobs slowed and her breathing evened. When Clara finally looked at him, her eyes were wet too. "Thank you," she whispered. Will only nodded and stood to leave. But Lizzie's small hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "Stay." He froze. Clara's lips parted, unsure whether to release him or ask the same. Will lowered himself into the chair by the bed. He didn't sleep that night, but when dawn broke, Lizzie's hand was still tangled in his sleeve. And Clara's gaze, though red from tears, was softer than it had ever been. By the end of that week, the distance between them was no longer a canyon. It was a narrow creek, fragile but crossable. Clara still carried her shame like armor, still whispered apologies where none were needed. But Will began to see something stronger rising through the cracks, the will of a woman who had survived too much to be defined by what broke her. And Clara began to see, in the quiet of his eyes and the steadiness of his hands, that not all men demanded. Some simply stood. From the porch one evening, Will watched Clara humming a soft tune while Lizzie played in the grass. The setting sun painted the yard in gold. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt like something waiting to bloom. The Wyoming plains had a way of fooling a man. One day they looked like peace-wide skies, quiet fences, cattle moving slow across the grass. The next, they turned into an empty stage, where Trouble rode in bold as brass dot. It had been 2 weeks since Clara and Lizzie came to Will's ranch. 2 weeks of mended fences, cautious words, and the faint stirrings of something almost like hope. But hope doesn't ride fast. Enough to outrun the past Dot. It was late afternoon when Will first spotted the dust. He was stacking hay near the barn, sweat clinging under his shirt, when his eyes caught the faint curl of earth lifting against the horizon. A rider. No -3 Dot, he stiffened. Strangers didn't come this far without reason. Will laid down the pitchfork and wiped his palms on his trousers. He didn't call Clara right away. No need to scare her, unless the dust meant what he feared. Still, his jaw tightened, and his limp grew more pronounced as he walked back toward the house. Clara was at the pump, Lizzie gathering eggs in a little tin pail. Will's shadow fell across them before his voice did. "Inside," he said. "Quiet." Steady Dot. Clara straightened, alarm flickering across her face. She searched his eyes, then nodded without question. She ushered Lizzie in with a hand on her back. Shutting the door behind them, Dot stood on the porch, waiting. The riders came into focus as the sun dipped lower. 2 men and 1 woman. All bore the look of hard miles, dust coating their coats, revolvers heavy at their hips. The one in front, tall and lean with a hawk's nose, held himself like a man used to ownership. They stopped at the gate. "You Carver?" The leader called, voice sharp as broken glass. "Name's Will," he answered flatly. The man smirked. "Good. Saves me a skin twice." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it aloft like scripture. "Name's Doyle. Marcardo. I've got claim to a woman by the name of Clara Sloane, and her little whelp belong to me by debt and by law." Will didn't flinch. He'd seen Clara's shadowed fear in quiet moments, had heard pieces of her past spoken like confessions she didn't owe him. But this was the first time the past had worn a face. "You'll turn 'em over," Doyle continued, "and I'll be on my way. You've had 'em long enough." From behind the curtain inside, Will sensed Clara watching, felt her breath catch even from this distance. He let the silence hang heavy, then said low, "Ain't yours to claim." Doyle's grin widened, cruel. "Paper says otherwise." He waved it again. The seal was smeared, the ink thin. Even from the porch, Will saw it for what it was, a forgery. But out here, truth often bowed to the man with the loudest voice. Woman rider spat into the dust. "Don't make this harder, cowboy. She ain't worth dying over." Will stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. His boots crunched the dirt, his limp more visible with each step. He stopped at the fence, resting one rough hand on the rail. "You come here thinking she's still chained," he said, voice carrying steady. "But she ain't, not anymore, not while she's under my roof." The second man laughed, sharp and bitter. "Your roof don't mean a damn thing when law's ridden with us. Then where's your badge?" Will shot back. The man bristled. Doyle raised a hand, silencing him. His smile was gone now, replaced with a thin, cold sneer. "You're making a mistake," Doyle said. "You've got cattle, land, a name worth something. Don't waste it on some broken woman and her brat. Let us take what's owed. You keep your pride intact." Will leaned closer, his hand still on the rail, his eyes sharp as flint. "You talk too much." The standoff stretched long enough for the air to thicken. Finally, Doyle crumpled the paper and shoved it back into his coat. "This ain't finished," he promised. "I'll be back. And I won't be a skin polite." He jerked his reins. The 3 turned, dust rising behind them as they rode off slow enough to let their threat hang in the air like gun smoke. Will didn't move until the dust settled back into the earth. Only then did he turn to the house. Clara was on the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself. Lizzie clung to her skirts, eyes wide and frightened. Who were they? Clara whispered. Trouble, Will said simply. That night, the house sat heavy with silence. The fire snapped, but no one spoke. Lizzie fell asleep early, curled on her mother's lap. When Will finally rose to check the locks on the door, Clara's voice stopped him. They won't stop, she said quietly. Marcardo. He's been after me for months. My husband died, owing him more than I could ever pay. When I couldn't, he tried to take me instead. Said my labor would square the debt. When I ran, he promised he'd hunt me down. That he'd take Lizzie too. Her hand trembled as she smoothed Lizzie's hair. I thought if we made it far enough, if no one saw us, maybe he'd forget. But men like him don't forget. Not when. They think they own you. Will stood by the door, shadows cutting across his face. He thought of his daughter, gone to fever before she could grow tall. Thought of his wife, married too soon. Thought of the silence he'd lived with since. He turned slowly. He'll come back. And when he does, he won't find what he's looking for. Clara met his eyes. For the first time, she didn't look away. You'll fight him, she said, half in awe, half in fear. Will nodded once. If I have to. Her throat worked. She wanted to speak, to tell him he didn't owe her that. But Lizzie stirred against. Her small fingers gripping her blouse, and the words died, because maybe, just maybe, Will Carver wasn't fighting for her. Maybe he was fighting for the little girl who had whispered, "Please take her instead of me, Dot," and maybe he was fighting for something he'd thought was buried with his own blood, the chance to protect a family. The wind rose that night, rattling the shutters. Clara lay awake long after Lizzie's breath evened out, listening to the creak of floorboards where Will kept watch. He sat in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, his silhouette outlined by the dying fire. For the first time since she'd been dragged into Marcardo's debt, Clara felt the faintest sliver of something foreign, not fear, not shame, but safety. She closed her eyes and let it carry her into sleep. The morning after Doyle Marcardo's visit, the Wyoming plains wore their usual mask of silence. But Will Carver knew better. Silence could be a warning just as much as a blessing. He saddled his horse before the sun cleared the hills, jaw tight, movement steady as ritual. Clara stood on the porch, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, Lizzie clinging to her side. "You're riding out," Clara said softly. Will didn't answer at first. He adjusted the cinch, tugged it twice, then finally turned toward her. "Marcardo's the kind that don't scare easy. He'll be back with more men, maybe even papers that'll fool a judge. I aim to make sure when he comes, there's no law nor man alive who can take you or your girl." Her brows knit. "What are you saying?" Will swung into the saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. "I'm ridden to town." His voice was flat, deliberate. "To put my name on yours." Clara blinked. "You mean marriage?" Will nodded once. "He comes with debts, with forged papers, with threats. But he can't take another man's wife. Not without staring the hole." "County." Clara's breath caught. She glanced at Lizzie, whose little fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. "You don't have to," Clara began. But Will cut her off with a look. "I know what I have to do," he said simply. Then he tipped his hat and rode off toward Clearwater. The town was already stirring when he arrived. Wagons clattered along Main Street. Women carried baskets from the mercantile, and the hammer of a blacksmith rang sharp and steady from the far end. But every step Will's boots made on the boardwalk carried weight. He walked straight past the saloon, past the barber shop, until he reached the sheriff's office. Sheriff Abel Granger sat behind a desk, a pipe clenched between his teeth, sorting through a stack of warrants. He looked up when Will entered. "Well, I'll be damned." Will Carver. Thought you'd gone half feral out there on your ranch. Will's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I need a witness. And a preacher, today. Granger leaned back, pipe, smoke curling around his head. That so? What's the occasion? Will set his palms flat on the desk. There's a woman. Clara Sloan. Widow. Got a little girl with her. They've been run hard by Doyle Marcardo and his kind. He came to my place yesterday with papers saying she belonged to him. You and I both know his brand of paper don't mean a damn thing, but he'll keep trying. The only way to shut him up is to make it clear she's under my name. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. You're talking marriage. I'm talking protection, Will said firmly. Granger studied him for a long moment. You sure this is protection and not something more? Will's jaw tightened. Don't matter what it is. Just needs doing. The sheriff let the silence drag before nodding. Preacher's down by the church. I'll send word to bring him. You'll need Clara here, though. Ain't no wedding without the bride. By the time Clara arrived, the word had already spread. Folks peered from doorways, curious eyes following as Will escorted her down the dusty street, Lizzie skipping uncertainly between them. Clara's cheeks burned under their gaze. Her shawl pulled tighter as whispers followed. Is that the widow? Sloan? Carver's marrying her? Didn't think he had it in him. At the church, Preacher Howell stood with a Bible in hand, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Will Carver, he said in surprise. Didn't expect to see. You here for another 20 years. Let's make it today, Will replied. Clara froze at the threshold. Her eyes darted from the preacher to Will, then to Lizzie. This isn't right, she whispered. You don't even know me. You don't owe me this. Will turned to her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. Listen to me. Marcardo's. The kind of man who'll chew through rope and law alike. But he can't touch a man's wife. Not in this territory. Not without staring the hornet's nest. You want to keep Lizzie safe. This is how we do it. Clara's throat worked. She looked down at Lizzie, who stared up with wide, hopeful eyes. Mama? The little girl asked. Does this mean we get to stay? Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she met Will's steady gaze. Yes, she said at last, voice trembling. It means we get to stay. The vows were simple, spoken in quiet tones that barely carried beyond the walls. Will's voice was low and steady, each word like a nail driven into oak. Clara's was soft, breaking once, but she pressed on, her hand trembling in his until he steadied it with a gentle squeeze. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Lizzie clapped her hands and laughed, the sound bright against the hush. Outside, the hush didn't last. Doyle Marcardo stood on the boardwalk, 2 men at his back, papers in hand. He'd arrived just as the bells rang, and his eyes burned when he saw Clara emerge from the church with Will at her side. You think a ring and a few words change the law? Doyle spat. Will stepped down onto the street, placing himself squarely between Clara and Marcardo. It ain't just words, he said evenly. It's a line in the sand. You cross it, and you'll answer to me, the sheriff, and every man in this town who don't take kindly to thieves dressed up as gentlemen. The crowd murmured. Sheriff Granger appeared at Will's side, hand resting easy on his revolver. Best you move along, Doyle, he said. Your papers ain't worth the ink, and now you got no claim. She's Carver's wife, by church and law. Doyle's face twisted. His men shifted uneasily, sensing the tide turning against them. Finally, with a hiss of disgust, Doyle crumpled the papers and tossed them into the dirt. This ain't finished, he growled. Then it's your grave to dig, Will replied coldly. That night, back at the ranch, Clara stood on the porch, staring at the stars. Lizzie slept inside, curled beneath the quilt. Will leaned against the post, silent as always. His arm bandaged from the scrape Doyle's man had left in the scuffle. "You didn't have to do it," Clara whispered. "Not for me." Will turned his head, his eyes shadowed but steady. "I didn't do it for you alone. I did it for her." He nodded toward the window where Lizzie slept. Then softer, "And maybe for me, too." Clara's breath caught. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she saw not just the lonely rancher who'd pulled her from chains, but the man who had risked his name, his land, and his peace to give her and her daughter a chance. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage across the dark. Clara's hand hovered, then rested lightly on Will's arm. He didn't pull away, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel what safety might taste like. The Wyoming wind had a way of carrying warnings before men ever spoke. That morning, Will Carver woke to silence too sharp, too still. No birds on the fence, no rustle in the grass. Even the cattle huddled uneasy against the far fence line. He, strapped on his revolver, the leather creaking loud in the quiet. Clara watched from the porch, her shawl pulled tight, though the sun already burned. Lizzie clung to her skirts, wide-eyed, sensing what her mother didn't say. "They're coming, aren't they?" Clara whispered. Will didn't answer. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing against the glare. Then he saw it, dust rising in the east, curling like smoke. Riders, more than 3 this time. "Get inside," Will said quietly. "Bar the door." Clara's hand trembled on Lizzie's shoulder. "Will," he cut her off with a look, "do as I say. Don't open that door for anyone but me." She swallowed, nodded once, and pulled Lizzie inside. The door shut, the bar dropped. The house fell silent. Will stepped off the porch, boots sinking into dust, and walked out toward the corral. The riders came into view, 7 of them, hard-faced men with rifles slung across their saddles. At their head was Doyle. Marcardo, his long duster flapping, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Well now," Doyle drawled, reining his horse at the fence. "Heard the good news. You and the lady tied the knot. Mighty romantic." He spat into the dirt. "But romance don't cancel debts, Carver. That woman still owes, and I've come to collect." Will rested one hand on the rail, the other hovering near his hip. "You got no claim here. She's my wife. Your papers are ash. Your threats are wind. Turn back while you still can." Doyle laughed, the sound ugly. "Your wife? Hell, Carver, you think saying vows in front of some half-drunk preacher changes what she is. She's merchandise, property, and property don't get saved by a ring." The men behind him chuckled, shifting in their saddles, eyes sharp with hunger. Will's gaze didn't waver. "Step foot on this land, Doyle, and you'll find yourself property of the earth. 6 feet under." The words hung in the air like the click of a hammer pulled back. Doyle's grin faltered. "So that's how it is?" "That's how it is." 4. A heartbeat. No one moved. Then Doyle barked, "Take him." The yard exploded into chaos. 2 men spurred forward, rifles lifting. Will ducked behind the fence post as bullets splintered wood. He drew fast, his Colt roaring once, twice. One rider toppled from the saddle, crashing into the dust. The other cursed, his arm bleeding, his horse bolting wild. Will sprinted to the trough, diving behind it as shots peppered the yard. Dust and splinters filled the air. From inside the cabin came Lizzie's scream, muffled by Clara's desperate shushing. "Carver!" Doyle shouted over the gunfire. "Come out, and maybe I'll leave the woman breathing." Will answered with, "Lead." His shot clipped the hat clean off Doyle's head, sending the outlaw scrambling behind a fence rail. The battle dragged across the yard, horses screaming, bullets slamming into wood, smoke stinging the air. Will moved with grim precision, every shot measured, every step deliberate. But he was only one man, and they were too many. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing flesh. He grunted, staggered, but stayed on his feet. Blood soaked his sleeve. Inside the cabin, Clara's heart hammered. She clutched Lizzie to her chest, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Through the shutter crack, she saw Will standing tall against 7 men, blood on his arm, but fire in his eyes. Something inside her snapped. "No more hiding," she whispered. She grabbed the rifle Will kept by the hearth. Her hands shook, but she loaded it, cocked it, and pushed Lizzie under the bed. "Stay there, don't move." Then she threw open the door. The sudden sound made Doyle glance back. Clara stepped onto the porch, rifle braced against her shoulder. Her shawl whipped in the wind, her hair wild, her face pale but steady. "You want me, Doyle?" she shouted. "Here I am." For a moment, everything froze. Then Doyle grinned wide. "Well, look at that. The bride's got bite." Will's eyes burned. "Clara, get back inside." But she didn't. She fired. The shot rang true, clipping Doyle's horse and sending the animal rearing. Doyle tumbled into the dirt, cursing. His men hesitated, startled by the ferocity of the woman they thought broken. Will seized the moment. He charged, tackling one man off his horse, their bodies slamming into the dust. They wrestled, fists and knives flashing, until Will's hand found the revolver and ended it with a thunderous shot. Doyle scrambled to his feet, mud smeared across his coat, eyes burning with rage. He drew his pistol, aimed at Clara on the porch. Slowed Will, still on one knee, saw it. Clara, rifle empty, stood frozen. Lizzie's terrified eyes gleamed from the window. Doyle's finger curled on the trigger. Will roared, lifted his Colt, and fired. The bullet struck Doyle square in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide, then collapsed face first into the dust. Silence fell. The remaining men glanced at each other, pale, shaken. One dropped his rifle. Another spurred his horse and fled. Within seconds, the yard was empty, but for the dead and the dying. Will stood slowly, chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm. His revolver hung loose in his hand. Clara rushed from the porch, skirts tangling around her legs, and caught him as he swayed. "You're bleeding." "I've had worse," he muttered, but his knees buckled. She held him, her small frame steadying his broad shoulders, and lowered him gently against the porch rail. Lizzie burst from the cabin, tears streaming, and threw herself into Will's lap. "Papa!" she cried. The word struck harder than any. Bullet. Will froze, then slowly lifted his good arm and wrapped it around her. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them, her hand gripping his. "You saved us," she whispered. Will shook his head weakly. "No, we saved each other." The wind shifted. The silence that followed was not heavy, but full, a silence of victory, of survival, of something new born in blood and fire. And as Doyle Mercado's body cooled in the Wyoming dust, Will Carver realized he had finally buried more than his enemies. He had buried his loneliness. The yard smelled of smoke, sweat, and blood. Doyle Mercado lay sprawled in the dust, his fine coat torn open where Will's bullet had struck clean through. The last of his men had ridden hard for the hills, leaving only silence behind. Clara knelt at Will's side on the porch steps, her hands steady on his bandaged shoulder. Lizzie clung to him, face pressed to his chest, whispering through tears, "Papa, don't leave us." Will's jaw tightened. He hadn't earned that name yet, not in his own mind, but the weight of it settled in his chest, heavier and warmer than any burden he'd carried before dot by afternoon. Word had already traveled faster than the wind. The sheriff rode up with 2 deputies, dust caked to their boots, rifles across their saddles. Abram Cates was an old war friend of Will's, a man with silver in his beard and sharpness still in his eyes. "Well, damn," Abram muttered as he swung down, surveying the scene. "Leave you alone for a few months, and you start a graveyard. In your own front yard." Will sat propped against the porch post, pale but upright. "Didn't ask for it, Abram." "Never do," the sheriff said, tugging his hat lower. His gaze shifted to Doyle's body, then to Clara, standing with Lizzie half hidden in her skirts. Clara's eyes didn't flinch from the sheriff's, though. Her hands still trembled faintly. "Who's this?" Abram asked. Will's gaze lingered on Clara, then he said, steady as stone, "My wife." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to say it so boldly, not yet, but she saw the flicker of steel in his eyes. He was laying down a line, not just for the sheriff, but for the world. Abram studied them both, then let out a low whistle. "Well, congratulations, I reckon." He glanced back at Doyle's body. "Looks like some folks didn't send a gift basket." The deputies chuckled, but Abram raised a hand. "Don't laugh yet." Doyle Marcardo was trouble, but he was connected. Men like him don't ride alone without someone pulling strings. "We'll need to make this official, Will. A hearing, maybe. You know how it is." Will's eyes darkened. "You mean paperwork." "I mean justice," Abram replied. "Folks, we'll talk. Doyle's brothers might come sniffing around, or worse. If this woman's name ain't cleared proper, there'll always be another claim. You want her safe, you stand up in town and make it law." Clara stiffened. "I don't want the whole town staring at me like I'm some prize to be fought." "Over." Abram's expression softened. "Ma'am, I've seen plenty of women dragged through courtrooms like cattle. Ain't right. But if you want to stay free, you got to stand in the light. Hiding won't cut it. Not anymore." Will reached over, took Clara's hand in his rough palm. "Then we'll stand together." The next morning, Will hitched the wagon. His arm was bound, stiff with pain, but his eyes burned steady. Clara sat beside him, Lizzie nestled between them, her small hand gripping his sleeve. The ride into Clearwater was long and tense. Townsfolk stared as the wagon rolled past, curious, whispering, some sympathetic, some scornful. Will ignored them. All. Clara kept her chin high. Though her cheeks flushed with shame, she couldn't quite bury Dot at the courthouse. The crowd was already thick. Doyle's kin had arrived, red-faced and loud, demanding vengeance. His younger brother, Victor Marcardo, waved forged contracts in the air, claiming Clara was indentured property, her child collateral. "She's ours," Victor shouted, voice cracking with rage. "You can't steal what's owed by law." Clara's knees wavered. Will's hand steadied her as they entered. The courtroom smelled of ink and dust, benches creaking under the weight of settlers eager for spectacle. Judge Halvorsen, gray and grim, presided with eyes like chipped granite. "Bring the parties forward," he ordered. Victor strutted to the front, contracts shaking in his hand. "Your Honor, these papers prove the woman known as Clara Sloan belonged to my brother Doyle under contract. She fled, taking the child. She is thief and deserter both. That man," he jabbed a finger at Will, "stole her outright." Gasps rippled through the room. Clara trembled, but Will's grip on her hand anchored her. When the judge motioned, Clara stepped forward. Her voice wavered at first, then steadied. "I am no man's property," she said. "Those papers are lies written by men who beat me, starved me, branded my wrists like cattle." She pulled back her sleeve, exposing scars raw and ugly. "Is this what law protects? Chains and whips?" A hush fell. Victor sneered. "Scars prove nothing. She could have run from anywhere. My brother paid for her labor. That child ain't even hers. The debt binds them both." The judge turned to Will. "And what say you?" Will's voice rolled like thunder. I say she's my wife. I say I paid in gold to free her, and I paid in blood to keep her. Doyle Marcardo rode onto my land with rifles and threats. He left in the ground. That's the truth of it. Judge Halvorson's eyes narrowed. Sheriff Cates, your testimony? Abram stood from the back, rifle slung low. I seen the bodies. Myself. Doyle came armed, papers or no papers. Carver defended his land, his wife, and the girl. Far as I'm concerned, that's lawful. Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded approval. Others muttered discontent. The judge raised his gavel. Enough. I have heard both sides. These so-called contracts are forged, lacking seal or witness. They bear no weight in this court. The woman Clara Sloan is free. Her marriage to William. Carver is recognized under territorial law. Any man who disputes it disputes the authority of this court. The gavel struck. The room erupted. Victor shouted curses as deputies dragged him out, still waving his useless papers. Clara's breath rushed out in a sob. Lizzie clutched her skirt, eyes wide. Will squeezed her hand, jaw hard but eyes soft. You're free, he whispered. She turned to him, tears streaking her cheeks, but her smile steady at last. No, Will, we're free. That evening, back at the ranch, neighbors drifted in quietly. They brought bread, quilts, even a new cradle someone had built by hand. No speeches, no questions, just small gestures, silent acknowledgments that the Carver place was no longer haunted by ghosts, but alive with new hope. On the porch, Lizzie tugged Will's sleeve. Papa, she said, shy but certain now, can you swing me tomorrow? On the rope out back? Will knelt slowly, wincing with his wound, and brushed a curl from her forehead. Tomorrow and every day after. Clara stood nearby, lantern light soft on her face. She reached for Will's hand, their fingers laced, rough calluses against. Tender skin. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, the sound of neighbors laughing softly. For the first time in years, Will Carver felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The law had spoken, the town had seen, and the chains of the past had broken. He looked at Clara, at Lizzie, at the quiet glow of the home behind them. It's over, he said. Clara leaned into him, her eyes shining. No, Will, it's just beginning. The snow fell soft that morning, a thin lace drifting across the Wyoming plains. The land looked clean, washed of dust and blood, as if the past weeks had never happened. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, filling the rooms with warmth. That felt new, earned while Carver stood at the stove, stirring a pot of coffee with one hand, his bandaged arm stiff but healing. He glanced toward the small bedroom, where Lizzie's laughter spilled like sunlight through the door. Clara sat on the quilt beside her, brushing out the girl's tangled curls with gentle strokes. For years, Will had woken to silence cold mornings. Empty rooms, the creak of a lonely porch under his boots. But now, the sound of a child's giggle filled the rafters, and a woman's voice hummed low, steady as the crackle of firewood. Clara looked up when she caught him watching. Their eyes met, and though neither spoke, something passed between them, an understanding, fragile but strong. Like the first green shoot, pushing through frost. Later that day, Will took Lizzie outside. The rope swing he'd strung from the cottonwood swayed gently in the wind. Lizzie climbed on, her small hands gripping the worn hemp tight. Ready? Will asked. Higher, Papa. She squealed. The word struck him like a hammer to the chest. Not with pain, but with something deeper, something he hadn't felt since the day he buried his wife and daughter. Papa. He pushed the swing. Slow at first, then stronger, until Lizzie's laughter rang out across the yard like music. From the porch, Clara watched, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The sight of her daughter flying against the pale winter sky, her curls wild, her smile unbroken, brought tears to her eyes. She pressed her hand to her lips, whispering a prayer of gratitude she hadn't dared speak in years. When Will slowed the swing and Lizzie leapt into his arms, Clara stepped forward, meeting them halfway. She touched Lizzie's cheek, then reached for Will's hand without hesitation. Their fingers interlocked as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Lizzie lay curled in Will's lap, dozing. After a supper of beans and fresh cornbread, Clara had baked herself. Her small hand clutched the wooden horse Will had carved for her. Clara reached across the table, laying her hand over Will's. "You've given her back her childhood," she whispered. Will shook his head. "She gave me back my life." The silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was warm, alive, stitched together with shared breath and unspoken promises. Clara's eyes softened. "You called me your wife in front of the whole town." "Did you mean it, Will?" He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight carving lines of truth across his face. Then he nodded. "I meant every word. I don't have fine rings or church papers yet, but if you'll have me, I'll stand with you till the land runs dry and the sky falls quiet." Her breath caught. For years she had been passed like property, her worth measured in contracts and coins. But this was choice. This was love that didn't claim, but cherished. Clara leaned across the table, pressing her forehead to his. "Yes, Will, I'll have you. And not because you saved us. Because you see me. Because you see her. Because you stayed when you could have walked away." He kissed her then, slow and trembling. Not the kiss of hunger, but of healing. Lizzie stirred. In his lap, blinked sleepily, then smiled when she saw them. "Does this mean we're a family now?" she asked. DROWSI. Clara cupped her daughter's cheek. "Yes, sweetheart, a family." Weeks passed, and the Carver Ranch took on a new rhythm. Clara planted herbs by the window, humming as she worked. Lizzie chased chickens across the yard, her laughter chasing away the ghosts that had once haunted the place. Will built a new crib in the corner of the cabin, not because he expected another child, but because hope demanded space to grow. Neighbors, who had once kept their distance, now visited, bringing quilts, fresh milk, and quiet respect. The sheriff himself stopped by one afternoon, tipping his hat at Clara. "Folks are talking, Mom. They say Will Carver found himself a family. Worth fighting for." Clara smiled, her hand resting lightly on Will's arm. "They're right, Sheriff. He did." One spring morning, Clara walked with Will to the edge of the field where bluebonnets bloomed in thick waves. The sky stretched wide above them, endless and forgiving. She turned, taking in the view the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. Lizzie picking flowers with hands too small to hold them all. Will beside her, tall and steady. "I never thought I'd have this," Clara whispered. Will wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Neither did I, but sometimes the land gives back what it took, in its own time." She leaned into him, eyes wet but smiling. "Then let's keep it, Will. Let's keep it no matter what comes." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice low and sure. "We will. You have my word." That night, as the stars burned sharp against the black, Clara tucked Lizzie into bed. The girl clutched her wooden horse tight and whispered, "Mama, Papa's not going to leave us, is he?" Clara's throat tightened, but she smiled. "No, darling, he's here to stay." From the doorway, Will watched, his heart swelling with a kind of joy that hurt to hold. When Clara rose, he caught her hand, and together they stood in the quiet glow of lamplight, watching Lizzie drift into dreams. Will whispered, almost to himself, "Home. After all these years, I finally came home. Clara squeezed his hand. No. Will, we made one. The wind outside hushed, carrying the promise of a gentler season. Inside, 3 hearts beat steady, no longer alone, no longer afraid. In the Wild West, where law was fragile and life was cheap, they had found something stronger than iron and truer than blood. They had found family. And as the fire crackled low, a voice seemed to rise from the silence, a reminder for those listening. Beyond the page, beyond the trail. If this story touched you, if you believe love can rise from dust, danger, and brokenness, then don't just ride on. Like, share, subscribe, because here in the Wild West, stories like these don't end. They keep riding.